Hello and welcome to this rerun of our webinar on the provisional settlement this week. Sorry to those of you who weren't able to make it this morning. I think there's something wrong with our Teams subscription. We only let 100 people into the webinar, and it would only allow it to go on for 60 minutes, and it wouldn't allow me to record either. So that wasn't a particularly good start to the webinar. So we've agreed to rerun it and at least to re-record it. You won't unfortunately get the conversation, the discussion we had at the end of the webinar, but I'll try and bring those points in where I can during today. So let's see how we go on. The provisional settlement was announced on Monday this week. We've kind of got into a pattern now of provisional settlements being released late in the year, just before Christmas. The new development, though, was the policy statement that was released last week on the 12th of December. The idea behind that being that it would give us an idea about what the assumptions are and the principles are that will be used in the settlement this week. I'm not quite sure why they thought that was necessary, given that the 19th of December is not a particularly late date for the settlement, but that's where they've got to. In many ways, for me, I thought the policy statement was actually more like a summer consultation, one that we might get in July or September, setting out kind of like the thinking that ministers have got about the statement. In some ways, it didn't really help us all that much. The idea had been that local authorities would have been able to work out for themselves what the settlement would look like in quite a lot of detail. In practice, I think it was quite hard to do that. A lot of the fine grained detail wasn't there. A lot of none of the numbers were there. And there's some quite big gaps in the assumptions that they gave us, and some vagueness at times which didn't really help. So my view would be I'd prefer them to go back to a proper summer consultation with just a single provisional settlement in December, ideally early in the month. The 4-week consultation period starts now, with the consultation closing on the 16th of January. So the key headlines from the settlement this week, and I guess a lot of them were either announced beforehand in the autumn statement or in last week's policy statement. The autumn statement announced that the business rate multiplier would be frozen, i.e. it remains at 49.9 pence. But as we now know, that contains an adjustment for revaluation, which would take the multiplier downwards, and then a capped inflation amount of 3.74%. So in other words, it's frozen in that it still remains at 49.9 pence. It was frozen in cash terms, but actually it does include some capped inflation within there of 3.74%. I think it would have been easier for us if they'd explained it as capped inflation of 3.74%, but clearly the message they wanted to get out to the wider world was that business rates multiplier had been frozen. That decision to effectively freeze or cap the multiplier was then fully funded through the settlement. This seems to be the new principle. It's actually a principle that's been in place for a number of years, but it's only really been, I think, properly stated in the last couple of years or so, that they do fully fund inflation through the business rate system. So if inflation is running at 10.1%, some of that inflation was funded via a baseline funding level uplift. That's 3.74%. RSG itself was uplifted by 10.1%. And then cap compensation at 85 over 499 compensates us for the fact that baseline funding level wasn't uplifted by 10.1%, only 3.74%. So taking those three factors together, the government has indeed fully funded its decision to freeze or cap the multiplier in 2023-24. So I think they've treated the sector fairly well on that basis. There is, once again, no negative RSG for higher need authorities. That's something I think really to complain about. But for many authorities who will be listening to this, many district councils, some county councils, and lower need unitaries, this decision to no longer to continue with no negative RSG will be very welcomed indeed. A number of grants were rolled into the settlement in 2023-24. So £78 million worth of grants were rolled into RSG. So some of you who've not had RSG for a while will now have it just because of those rolled in grants. And then social care grant received a roll in of the Independent Living Fund of £160 million. New Homes bonus continues for another year or maybe two. This is New Homes bonus, as we said a number of times, is the great survivor. for quite a number of years now, it's been the last year of the new homes bonus, so it's about to be phased out as a consultation on its future. We've got at least one more year, and our view, to be honest, is that there's almost certainly another 2 years, so one more year after this. Government's agreed that it will tell us what it wants to do before the next settlement, but I'm not convinced it'll be anything very different from what we've got now. The new 3% funding guarantee replaces the lower tier services grant. This is the new sort of damping or floor mechanism that the government's got to ensure that, well, in this case, that no authority has an increase in core spending power that's less than 3%, and that excludes the impact of a Band D increase. So basically, it ensures that your grant funding goes up by 3% per year. That replaces the lower tier services grant, which one part of that was a floor element, which ensured that your core spending power in totality did not reduce in cash terms. So it's a kind of a replacement, but it's a more generous replacement than what was in the lower tier services grant. Then there were a whole range of additional social care grants. Largely these were announced in the autumn statement in 2022, but as we'll explore later, there were some interesting decisions on the distribution of those grants. Whether we quibble those too much, one of them in particular is a fairly strange decision. The Band D thresholds were also largely announced in the autumn statement, and again, as we know already, these were higher than we had been anticipating. The core Band D thresholds will be 2.99% next year. For shire districts and fire authorities, you can increase your Band D by the higher of £5 or 2.99%. Police and crime commissioners can increase by 15% in 23-24 and £10, so £15 in 23-24 and then £10 in 24-25. And then, of course, for social care authorities, there's a further extension in the adult social care precept. That'll be 2% in 23-24 and 24-25. So social care authorities effectively have got a 5% increase in Band D in each of the next 2 years. Looking a bit further ahead, I was a little bit disappointed about how little there was in the settlement about 2024-25. The policy statement covers both the next 2 financial years, but we didn't get any figures for 24-25 in the settlement. So even though they've kind of outlined what their principles are, there is still quite a lot of uncertainty in places about what will happen in 24-25. The policy statement said that the core settlement will continue in a similar manner for 24-25, and the major grants will continue as set out in 23-24. So in some respects, they clearly are intending that the way the settlement was constructed in 23-24 will continue into the following financial year. I think there are some things that we can be fairly sure about. The first is that BFL and RSG are uplifted by inflation, and that could be quite significant next year if inflation is still running at, say, 7.5%. And then any amounts that are not any amounts that based on funding level doesn't go up by, or any under indexing of baseline funding level will be fully compensated by a cap compensation Section 31 grant. So I think that's a fairly strong principle now that we can apply to our forecasts for 24-25. I think the same thing for social care grants, both the amounts and the distribution. The amounts we're fairly sure of now because of the announcement in the autumn statement, and I think distribution is almost certainly going to follow the same pattern as 23-24. So I think we can take those things as givens now, although as often is the way, there might be some change around the margins, but broadly speaking, I think we know where we are with the social care grants. And the same with council tax Band D thresholds. They've pretty much now been announced for the next 2 years, and I'd be surprised if they change at all. The things we can be less sure about, the first of those is new homes bonus. Ministers are clearly going to have another think about NHB. Our view is that a further year is still the most likely option, but they clearly are looking at other options. No one's particularly happy with NHB unless you're an authority that's getting it. So that's always very vulnerable. And then this 3% funding guarantee. We've had quite a lot of questions about this because for some authorities, some district councils, this is now a really significant element of their funding for next year. So, but it was termed as a new one-off funding guarantee. So there's no guarantee that it does continue into 24-25. But I think some form of of course, spending power related guarantee is necessary and is likely to continue. The 3% funding guarantee really is just a variation or an extension of the lower tier services grant. So I think that kind of approach is very, very likely. The issue would be whether, is it 3%, is it something lower, is it something higher? We just don't know. So here we have the core spending power figures that were announced in the settlement. So a few things that are worth picking out here. One was that the construction or sort of disaggregation of the different social care grants was slightly odd to follow to start off with, but I think we've worked out where everything has gone now, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a second. The 3% funding guarantee, the estimate is that it's £136 million in 23-24, slightly higher the year after, but around that sort of mark. That's funded by a combination of the whole of lower tier services grant and then some of the reduction in cost of new homes bonus. But as you can see, new homes bonus has gone down by a considerable amount. So not all, only a very, very small proportion of that has gone into the funding guarantee. We assume the rest of it has gone into SFA to fund the baseline funding level, or part fund the baseline funding level increase and the RSG increase. You might argue about, is that smoke and mirrors? Is that quite right? But I think it's reasonable in the context of the wider settlement that money has been transferred from NHB into other parts of the settlement. And of course, within SFA, I think you can very certainly argue that that's now distributed pro rata to needs, so it's not an unreasonable use of that surplus NHB funding. Services grant, I'm still calling it 22-23 services grant. It's just services grant now. That's reduced by a bit more than we were expecting. So that's reduced from 822 million to 464. We knew 200 million was coming out for the clawback of the national insurance contribution funding. That's 200 million. We also knew the top slice would be coming out for funding supporting families. I think that's about 40 million. It also appears there's been a transfer from services grant into social care grant of about 80 million. So that's there to fund or to part fund the cost of equalising the precept. I'm not quite sure why that couldn't have been done entirely within the social care grant, but there we are. They've raided the services grant to part fund equalisation within the social care grant. But then I think there was a further small transfer out of services grant, I assume again, into SFA. So again, you could argue that's slightly naughty doing that, but I think in the context of the overall settlement, that's perfectly reasonable. Core spending power is up by 5 billion, which is 9.2%. So that's a very, very strong cash terms increase in spending power. Then in 24-25, a further increase of 4.7 billion. That's 7.9% based on our figures projected forward. So again, two very strong increases in core spending power. Two final things to mention. One is rural services delivery grant that remains at 85 million, and then this adjustment for the rolled in grants. So these are the three grants that are rolled into RSG, 78 million, and then the 160 million pounds of independent living fund grant, which is rolled into social care. So that's just making sure that the baseline is adjusted for those amounts that are rolling in, and to make sure that the increase in core spending power is like for like 5 billion, 9.2%. And we can see here just how good the core spending power increases are in 23-24 and 24-25 in the context of what's gone on in the recent past. We've had a few fairly good core spending power settlements over the last 3 years. So 2021, 6%, 22-23, 8.2% core spending power increases. 21-22 looks low at 2.8%, but in fact, that was planned at 4.5%, and the only reason it's lower is because of the COVID-related hit to council tax income. So that's the only reason that looks a bit low. But before that, you can see, the increases were really, really small. And from 16-17 and before that, core spending power was going down. So between 2010 and 2016, core spending power went down every year in cash terms. So in that sense, in cash terms, we're doing an awful lot better than we have been in the recent past. It's also worth refreshing our memory that the settlements in 23-24 and 24-25 weren't expected to be as good as this. It was the spending review gave us a front-loaded settlement, so 8.2% increase in 22-23, but in theory, we were just relying on council tax increases alone in 23-24 and 24-25, and that would have given us core spending power increases of only just about 3% at best. So the autumn statement increase in funding, both for social care and for the increase in BFL and RSG in line with inflation, has really boosted the settlement that we've got in the next 2 years. So boosting up to 9.2% and 7.9%. So this year and the next 2 years are the best core spending power settlements that the sector's had really for well over a decade. And I think from memory is at least as good as anything that we had during the Labour government in the 2000s, when we had fairly strong settlements. So, by any measure, this is a good settlement, certainly in cash terms. Although I know a lot of you will are still struggling to balance your budgets, because in real terms, it's maybe not quite such a good settlement. There are lots of pressures on budgets, but that's the context anyway. The other thing a lot of people are saying is about the core spending power increases are reliant on councils putting up council tax band D, and that's true, they are. And I think lots of councils now are really reluctant to use the full threshold that they've got, particularly with the cost of living crisis. And I know the surveys that have been released by LGC and by others are showing quite clearly that lots of councils will not use that full increase. I think to some degree for a sector as a whole, that's a bit of a shame, because it maybe sends the wrong messages to the Treasury and to government, but that's local politics for you. That's how it works. We thought we'd do a bit of analysis of what's happened in recent years, whether councils have been using that maximum increase that authorities have got. It's not that easy to measure that, because it's not, as you know, it's not always a 1 year threshold that we measure against. In quite most years, it's been a 2 year threshold, or even a 3 year threshold with carried forward amounts. The easiest one to look at is that 2021 figure on the chart. In that year, you can see that virtually every type of authority, around 85 to 90% of councils, did use the maximum band D increase that was available to them. But you can see in other years it's not quite. It's very different from that. So in 21-22 and 22-23, as you remember, there was a 2 year threshold where councils could carry over from 21-22 into the following year. And you can see there for Shire County councils, only 30% of those councils used their full increase in the first year. That's because there were local elections in that year. But even so, the year after, by the end of that 2 year period, only just over 50% of Shire County councils had used their full threshold that was available to them. Other types of councils had used a higher proportion of the amounts available to them. So, for instance, Mets had used about 70% of the maximum available, or 70% of the metropolitan councils had used the maximum that was available to them. So even there, I think what you can probably say is that local elections make a big difference. Councils are more likely to use the maximum when it's a 1 year available threshold, oddly enough. But I think there's some evidence there's a little bit of fatigue now for councils putting up council tax by as much as they have been in recent years. So we may see quite a drop off this time round in how much band D goes up by. The exception to that is Shire District Councils, where around 85-90% of Shire District Councils have used the maximum threshold over the last few years. But I suppose you could argue that Shire districts have had a lower threshold. It's only 2% usually, sometimes 3% or £5. So it's a bit easier for them, I suppose, to justify using that maximum. But I think it's also been true to say that we've tended to think about core spending power as being, largely funded by increases in council tax. That was certainly the case up until 2020. I think in the last 4 or 5 years, things have really flipped around. As government funding has increased a lot more, the contribution of government funding to core spending power has increased as well. And if we look at 23-24, we can see that the contribution from government funding is much greater now than it is from council tax. So although the very high levels of core spending power increase are reliant on councils taking up the maximum increase, the big contribution now to core spending power increase is from government funding. So we can see there government funding increase was 3 billion in next year's settlement, up by 13.6%, and only 1.9 billion from council tax, up by 6%. So, even if councils don't use that maximum increase, the average increase of core spending power is still going to be, reasonably high. This chart shows you, in overall terms, what the distribution is of core spending power within the settlement this year. Dan's got some other charts in his presentation if you want to catch that, with more detailed analysis of the distribution within the settlement. But what you can see here is kind of a tale of two halves really within the sector. On the right, the dark blue blocks there, that's shire district councils. Their increases in core spending power are much lower than councils with social care responsibilities, and actually quite flat. So there's not that much difference between councils with the lowest and the highest increases in core spending power within the shire districts. That's because of the 3% funding guarantee in particular, but also because grant increases are not that significant otherwise for shire districts. Then the green blocks show you fire authorities doing slightly better than shire districts, but certainly less well than authorities with social care responsibilities. So fire authorities benefiting from the baseline funding level and RSG increases, and also with the slightly higher thresholds for Band D next year as well. But it's authorities with social care responsibilities that are getting the biggest increases in core spending power. And I think, as Dan will show you later on, it's quite a progressive distribution of gain. Councils with the lowest tax bases and the highest needs are getting the biggest increases in core spending power. Those towards the middle of the chart here, towards the bottom end of the social care authorities, they're the authorities that have got the highest needs and the lowest, the lowest needs and the highest tax bases. So it's a much more progressive distribution of funding within the core spending power figures. But at class level, it's quite interesting. You can see here that if you look at the figures in the green in the green boxes, that's the average increase for each class. And you can see here that they're quite well bunched. So there's not that much difference at class level between the averages for different types of authority. So you see there that shire counties and metropolitan authorities have got broadly the highest increases in core spending power next year. And that's because they do fairly well from the needs-based formulas, and also plenty of counties have got quite good tax bases as well. It also shows you, I think, the way that probably ministers have tried to manage the settlement, trying to make sure that at a class level there's not too much difference between the different classes. And it probably explains as well why they've made some of the decisions about the way they've equalised, say, the precept within social care. They've been quite generous, I think, to councils with high tax bases. But I think the impact of that is probably just to narrow the gap or narrow the range at class level between different types of authority. You can see as well London not doing quite so well as other types of authority with social care responsibilities. One of the reasons for that, particularly for inner London, is that Band D council taxes are so low. So their low Band Ds on average means that the core spending power goes up by less. District councils averaging 5% core spending power increase, a combination of that 3% funding guarantee being useful. For some authorities, that continuation of New Homes bonus, and also the slightly higher core increase in Band D. Fire authorities, a bit more of a mix, as we said, doing slightly better. Certainly combined fire authorities doing slightly better than districts, but not much more so. I think that figure for the metropolitan fire authorities, that could be a bit of a rogue. I'll have a look at that in a second. So settlement funding assessment, kind of mirroring what we said already, getting better and better in recent years. The increases in 23-24 and 24-25 largely driven by the fact that inflation is so much higher. Also, we can see there the first half of that chart. This is where SFA was being cut in cash terms still, since 2020-21. SFA has broadly increased in line with inflation, which, as we know, was relatively low 2020, 21, 22, but now is much, much higher, and that's why we can see that reflected in the higher increases in SFA. Also in 23-24, we've got these rolled-in grants. So Family Annex Grant, 7.4 million, LCTS Admin Grant, 69 million, and then the Food Safety Enforcement Grant, 1.5 million. one of the good things about those grants being rolled in to RSG is that they'll be uprated by inflation in the future years. So whereas you haven't had inflation on the council tax admin grant, you will now get it, which is a good thing. Again, we can see here what's happened with SFA in a slightly different way. We can see that those cash terms cuts in SFA until 2019-20, then from 2021 onwards, we can see how it's drifted up slowly in line with inflation and then more quickly in the next 2 years as inflation's kind of ramped up. We can also see that how baseline funding level has increased in line with inflation every year. And what that's meant is that RSG was squeezed between 16-17 and 19-20. But then since then, as the government's kind of changed tack in the way that it's uprated RSG, we can see that RSG has actually gone up in line with inflation over that period. So things have changed quite a little bit, but it does show that now that there's quite an established principle of RSG and BFL goes up in line with inflation, and any under-indexing of baseline funding level is then compensated through the cap compensation scheme. Looking at social care funding now, the table on the right there kind of pieces together the social care grants that are in the settlement for next year and the year after. I think we're fairly confident now with the numbers that are in there. Improved Better Care Fund staying flat in cash terms. The 22-23 social care grant being rolled into 23-24. The additional funding from the autumn statement in the next 2 years, which we had confirmed in the policy statement. Then this amount of resources that was rolled in from elsewhere in the settlement, this £81 million, that's to part fund the adult social care precept equalisation within the social care grant, about 80 million, and then independent living fund being rolled into the grant in 23-24, that 160 million. So we're fairly confident about that amount. Then Better Care Fund, £300 million next year, £500 million the year after. And then slightly odd, the ASC Market Sustainability and Improvement Fund. So that now combines the funding for the fair cost of care that you've already received in the current financial year, the £162 million, that rolls on for the next 2 years. And then this discharge fund. So that was the new amounts that were announced in the autumn statement in 22. Those two grants roll in together in a single pot. I don't know the purpose of those grants well enough to know whether they're actually doing the same thing or whether they're doing something a bit different. But nevertheless, that's the way that the H has decided to put them together. In terms of distribution, the social care grant is distributed using a combination of the adult RNF and equalising £160 million of the social care precept. That's £160 million out of around £580 million. So it's nowhere near full equalisation. But as you said, I think the purpose of doing that was to make sure that the ministers could manage the settlement and balance the gap or reduce the gap between the highest and the lowest increases in overall core spending power. So whilst it's not technically correct to do it that way, we can see why they've done it. The odder one, though, is how they've distributed the Better Care Fund. Now, it's not the biggest grant in the world, but it's just a strange decision to do what they've done. They've used the IBCF allocations in 23-24. I've no idea why. That uses a combination of the adult RNF allocations based on the 13-14 adult RNF and then equalised amounts of historic social care precepts. So the amounts, I think, from like 17-18 through to 18-19, 19-20. So I've no idea why those amounts are relevant to future allocations of Better Care Fund grant, but slightly puzzled by that, but that's how they've done it. And then the Social Care Market Sustainability and Improvement Fund, that's just used the adult RNF, so that's how we'd have expected things to be distributed, and that's how that one has been distributed. I think one comment that we had in the debate afterwards was about there are quibbles with the way, or you could quibble with the way that social care funding has been distributed, but it sort of disappears into the background in some respects just because of the sheer amount of increase in the amount of funding for social care. There's a big increase in quantum here. It's the biggest increase in social care funding that we've had, as far as I can remember. So there's a lot more money going in there. But, and this is another comment we had in the debate afterwards, was that there were a huge amount of pressures on social care funding now. There's demand pressures from social care, there's demand pressures from children's, and also the effect of starting the fair cost of care and then stopping it has meant that providers are still looking for their increases in fees for next year and the year after. They feel they were promised them, and they don't understand why they're now being reversed. So councils are under a lot of pressure to honour those semi-commitments without the funding to go along with it. So there's a lot of pressure on social care budgets next year, despite the big increases in funding. Then we move on to this 3% funding guarantee. And effectively what that does is it gives councils a guarantee that their core spending power will go up by at least 3% without having to increase their Band D council tax. So that takes into account all the changes in all the elements within core spending power, SFA, cap compensation, social care grants, etc. And also takes into account any increase in council tax yield from the tax base only, not from the Band D increases. We've been able to replicate the calculations very largely, but not precisely yet. And I think the reason we haven't been able to do that is because we haven't been able to work out what the government's been doing with its assumptions around tax base. They typically use the 4-year average increase to uplift the tax base every year. I thought that's what they would have done here, but it doesn't quite match. So let's see how they've done it. The differences are not very great, but it's just a niggle not to know what it is. And the guidance is quite vague, and there's no properly worked out example, so it's not that easy to do. Nevertheless, we've used our figures and our calculations to project forward into 24-25. So we're still assuming that the funding guarantee is in place, and it's based on the same methodology in 24-25 as well. We've had quite a few questions as well about whether the 10.1% inflation has been fully funded. We're fairly confident that it has been fully funded, but it's difficult to prove it. So inflation is 10.1% in the system. And one way of doing this, then one way we've chosen to try and do it, is by saying, okay, if the multiplier had indeed been fully frozen and we'd received compensation for that based on cap compensation alone, and here we use the example of Milton Keynes, cap compensation would have been just over £5 million, with a multiplier fraction of cap compensation fraction of 105 over 499. So cap compensation of 5 million and an RSG uplift of 586,000, giving us a total increase in funding of 5.6 million. Now in the settlement, we know that the uplift in baseline funding level has been, well, part of the funding has come through BFL at 3.74%. The remainder has then come through cap compensation at 85 over 499, and then RSG has been increased by the full uplift of 10.1%. So that gives us a similar sort of figure, 5.5 million uplift in the way that has happened through the settlement. Now it's not precisely the same thing, but we can have a good, a fair degree of confidence there that we have received the full level of funding for freezing the multiplier at 10 instead of increasing it by 10.1%. Now, as a further complication to that the business rate baseline has also gone up by 3.74%, excluding the revaluation adjustment. But we're assuming that your retained business rates has gone up by the same amount, by 3.74% inflation as well at baseline. So in that sense, the change in rates and the change in the baseline should net each other out. So I think, again, we can probably say that you have been fully funded for inflation. Revaluation itself, and again, we had quite a lot of questions about this in the discussion afterwards. And I think this is something where we do need to go back and do some more work with you and make it clear about what we think is happening with revaluation and how the adjustments fit together. Pardon me. Within the MTFP model itself, we have replicated the actual calculations that are being used in the settlement. So the MTFP model now does fully reflect the numbers that are in the settlement. So when you look at the MTFP tab in the MTFP model, you'll see the actual numbers from the settlement. So everything that's going to go through the settlement for revaluation has now gone through and is fully reflected in the model. Our revaluation adjustment calculations didn't quite match what's happened in the settlement. I think there were two issues with our calculations. One is around the way that we've included small business rate relief, and particularly I think designated areas. So if you've got enterprise zones, our numbers don't quite match up to that. But nevertheless, we've now replaced our calculations with the actual numbers in the settlement. But what's important is that when you use the model, that you make sure that you do update the business rate income in the model for what your actual NNDR1 form will look like next year. So at the moment, the numbers in there are just based on uplifted figures from the NNDR1 for 22-23. But you need to make sure of a couple of things. One is that you've made an adjustment for any central list transfers. So your business rate baseline will already have been reduced to reflect the fact that you may have a transfer to the central list. So you'll be expected to collect less business rates already within the system. So you need to make sure that your forecast for business rates for 23-24 marries up with that and does indeed reflect that transfer. Also checked what your assumption is for appeals. Our assumption is that the multiplier includes a 3.3 or 3.4% adjustment for appeals. You can, it's your judgment about what level of appeals you want to put in your forecast for next year, but that's the kind of national benchmark. So in the MTFP model, just make sure that you have input new figures for 23-24 into that 2023 reval tab in the MTFP model, just to make sure that the actual business rate income figures marry up with the assumed figures from the settlement. And as I said, we'll come back and we'll look at that in more detail in the new year to make sure that there's a full understanding of what's going on there. A couple of examples here. So this is Northamptonshire, Northamptonshire, a new unitary, and we can see here that their revaluation adjustment is 8.8 million. So in other words, the revaluation adjustment is assuming that this council can collect an additional 8.8 million pounds worth of business rates in 2023-24. Both the baseline funding level and the business rates baseline is then uprated or uplifted by inflation, the 3.74% inflation that's in the multiplier. The revaluation adjustment itself is also uplifted by inflation. So that gives us a new BFL, which is in the settlement, and then a new business rate baseline, which is not actually explicitly shown in the settlement, but is implicitly in there. What you will see in the settlement is the new top-up or tariff for your authority, and that effectively is the difference then between the new BFL and the new BRB. The way they do it in the settlement is they just apply inflation to the top-up or tariff, and then adjust by the revaluation adjustment as well. But that's effectively doing the same thing as uprating both BFL and BRB. They're both being uprated by the same value, so the effect is that you can get the same effect by just uprating the top-up or tariff separately. It's not very easy to see that from the settlement, but that's the way that we've done it in the model, and that's the way that the figures flow through. For Northamptonshire, I think they're the only authority that I've seen that goes from a top-up to a tariff, and that means they go from paying no levy to paying a small levy, and that actually does disadvantage them in financial terms. And that's something that we will investigate a bit further, because in theory for this authority, the effect of revaluation is not neutral. Bristol is another authority here, and a couple of things that are interesting about Bristol. One is that it does have a central list transfer, so the net effect of their revaluation adjustment is 3.6 million, but that reflects two separate things that are going on. One is an increase in their rateable values that would generate an additional 12 million pounds worth of business rate income, and offsetting that, a transfer from the local to the central list worth about 8.4 million. So a net adjustment of about 3.6 million, which reflects two different transfers going, or two different adjustments going in opposite directions. So obviously for Bristol, it's really important to make sure that their forecast business rate income in 23-24 does reflect the fact that that central list transfer has taken place, and that their business rate income next year will be reduced by that transfer from the local to the central list. That's really important. For Bristol as well, like a number of other authorities, there are issues with having a pilot, it just complicates matters. So the revaluation adjustment that we've taken out of the settlement is for the 50% scheme. That then has to be converted into the pilot shares and the pilot system. The top up tariff that you will have got if you're a pilot authority in the settlement is the pilot top up tariff that you actually get. So it already makes that adjustment. But in the model, we wanted to show exactly how those adjustments are made, so you can track through precisely how those top ups and tariffs are calculated. And of course, the business rate pilots will include your new RSG, new public health, social care, and transport funding elements. So that's it from us on this side. Dan's going to do his presentation separately, and that will be available on his website. We'll link to that, so make sure you can see that too. Many apologies for making a mess of the team's arrangements today, but hopefully that's made up for it, and you've got everything that you needed to do out of the presentation. Feel free to get in touch with me over the Christmas period. I will be keeping an eye on my emails from time to time. But otherwise, have a happy Christmas, and I will see you in the new year. Thank you and goodbye.